and welcome. I'm Dr. Himanshu Mathur, Assistant Professor, Department of Physiotherapy, Jaipur National University. I'm here again coming in front of you with a new topic today. And the topic of the day is planes and axis in physiotherapy. Or rather, I would say planes and axis in a human body movement. So first we need to understand what is actually going inside the human movement. Before going that, we should have a little knowledge regarding the surfaces of the human body. So here you can see the first surface that is coming, that is anterior. When I look from the front, oh my god, that's a push, and I'm going posterior, that is from the back. And when this, we have a midline at the center of the body, and when the object, or when I'm talking about the surface which is close to the midline of the body, that is called medial. And that what is going away from the midline of the body, that is called as lateral. Superior is up, and when I look down, that is inferior. So these are the different surfaces that I'll be talking about during the whole lecture today in this course. The surface which is away from the joint that is connecting is called distal, and towards the joint that is connecting is called proximal. So these are the surfaces. Now it is very easy for us to understand that the surface lying inside, that is called deep, and that is what is lying outside, it is called superficial. So moving ahead a little more, we must know regarding the anatomical position of the body. So whenever I stand straight with my palms facing forward and I'm looking straight with my hands and legs still, that is the anatomical position of the body without moving anything. And trust me, all the listeners of the day, today whatever axis, planes and movements I'll be talking about, that will be considered in the anatomical plane only, except a few things that I'll be mentioning personally over here. Alright, coming on to the topic of the day is planes and axis. Planes and axis is such a common thing that you must have learned in your physics also, and that is the same thing that you'll be employing in the human body movement. That is why the subject I'm teaching you today is fundamentals of biomechanics and exercise therapy. So you need to understand the concept of human motion. The concept of human motion is in a very much accordance with physics. That is the mechanics part. That is why the subject is known as bio and mechanics. So you are understanding the mechanics of the biological system of human body. Alright, so whenever I talk about a plane, plane is a plane surface. As it tells you, the word explains itself. Plane is a surface that has a capability to divide the body into two equal halves. And remember, my dear friends, plane is not just a surface, but it is an imaginary surface. You are not able to see this. So if you'll be able to see this, and the surface is cutting you in two halves, I don't think the people will remain alive anymore. Okay, so we are talking about the imaginary surfaces here that divides the body into two equal halves. Now let us see how does they do that. So today I'll be talking about the planes, and the planes are majorly classified into three parts, or there are commonly three planes that we talk about. One is the sagittal plane, one is the frontal or the coronal plane, and one is the transverse or the horizontal plane. Okay, I'll be discussing it in detail in just a moment. Now coming on to the other thing that we'll be talking is axis. Axis is AXIX. Okay, हम बात करते हैं हिंदी में एक चीज कहते हैं धुरी. धुरी मतलब we have an axis for every body, every matter that is present in this universe. Even Earth, even Moon, every body that is moving has an axis. Okay, the Earth also rotates on its own axis, so it has an axis. So this gives me an idea, a clue that for a movement I require a basic entity, that is axis. So without axis I cannot have any movement. And to be more precise, if I am talking about an angular motion, so I require an axis to have an angular motion. Okay, in my last lecture also I had a word regarding torque, I had a word regarding angular motion, I had a word regarding fulcrum. So axis is an imaginary line around which the movement takes place. I compare it with the plane. So the plane is a surface and the axis is a line. Plane is a surface along which the movement takes place, and axis is a line around which a movement takes place. So an axis always passes through the joint, passes through the fulcrum. When we talk about the composition of a lever that we had discussed in the last lecture, last video. So a lever has three parts, that is weight, effort and fulcrum. Okay, fulcrum is the point of pivotance. Okay, the point from where the bar or an object is pivoted. That is what is joint is in the human body. It corresponds to the joint in the human body. So a joint in the human body is the fulcrum. And always remember, my dear friend, that axis passes through the joint. Okay, and the movement takes place around the axis, and the movement takes place along with the plane. Again, talking about the types and what are the classification of the axis we have right here is, again, we have three types of axis present here. That is sagittal axis, coronal axis and vertical axis. Okay, the planes were sagittal, coronal, transverse. The axes are three again, which are there? Sagittal, coronal and vertical. So we have three axes, three planes and three axes. Alright, now coming on to a very important thing that I need to talk about is the body always perform movement through the plane and around an axis. Okay, so if this is a plane, or that is what I have discussed in the last slide, what I was talking about, that the movement always happen along with the plane and around the axis. If this is a plane, this table is a plane, the movement is taking place along with it. I cannot go through across, but an imaginary line, which is the axis, it can pass through. So the movement always happens around the axis. And one very important thing you must note down right now, that the relationship between an axis and plane. Axis always lies at perpendicular to the plane. Suppose this is a plane, so axis will always be perpendicular to it. Suppose this is the plane, axis will always be perpendicular to it. Suppose this is the plane, axis will always be perpendicular to it. Okay, now coming on to what are the types of the axis and planes available with us. Alright, before moving that, we have to discuss a very important aspect of the nomenclature. If you can see an image in the slide right here, that suggests there are a few joints there. It is basically the superior surface of the skull. I am looking at the superior surface of this area in this picture right here. Okay, now this says that we have various joints present to join the different bones of the skull. Okay, so the joint which is coming here, it is called coronal sutures. Let me tell you one thing, that the joints of the skull, which are non-moving joints, they are known as sutures. Okay, so the joints which are coming here, which is joining rather the frontal bone and the parietal bone, they are known as coronal sutures. And based upon these sutures only, the nomenclature of the axis and plane has been given. Alright, so that is why we need to remember these things. This is an important aspect of the axis and plane that we need to talk about. Okay, so the axis, the sutures or the joints which are joining the frontal bone and the parietal bone that runs like this, it is known as the coronal suture. And the suture which is lying straight beyond that, behind that, that is known as the sagittal suture. Alright, so that becomes very easy. The plane which is parallel or that corresponds with the coronal suture is the coronal plane. The plane that is corresponding to the sagittal suture is the sagittal plane. That becomes an easier thing. Alright. Now, if you can remember these sutures, if you can remember the relative position of these joints or the sutures, you can know easily about, or you can easily remember that by what name we can pronounce or we can understand the different types of planes and the axis. Alright. So coming on to our first type. The first type of plane that comes with us is a sagittal plane. Always remember one small thing. Suppose this is a plane that divides the body into two equal halves, left and right. Okay, a plane which is coming from the center like this and dividing the body into left and right. Always remember, it is an imaginary plane. It's not a physical plane. All right. अगर physical plane होगा तो कट जाऊंगा बीच में से मैं कट जाऊंगा तो काय का plane काय की axis. Okay. So it is an imaginary plane that divides the body into two equal halves. That is your left side and that is your right side. Okay. That becomes your sagittal plane. And I told you about the sutures also. The sagittal sutures runs like this. So the plane which corresponds the relative position of the sagittal suture, or that is parallel to the sagittal suture, that is known as your sagittal plane. Okay. So we always know that it divides the body into two equal halves, left side and right side. Now, very important thing. I told you just a few moments back that if the relationship between planes and axis. So every plane has some or the other relationship with the axis itself. Okay. So I told you that every plane or every axis lies perpendicular to the plane that we are talking about. So the axis that corresponds with the sagittal plane is your coronal axis. Okay. It is also known as frontal axis. Okay. And one more thing, if the plane is moving like this, the perpendicular should be like this. So it is going from this side and coming out from this side. Okay, it's like this pen. Okay, this is the sagittal plane and it is piercing it like this. So it is going from this lateral aspect to this lateral aspect. Alright, or if I talk about a particular joint, let's take an example of shoulder. Okay, if I am talking about shoulder, so the plane would be like this. The sagittal plane would be like this. And the axis which is passing, that is the coronal axis that is passing, that will be passing from here to here or from here to here. Okay. Just because it passes from one side to the other side, this axis is also known as medial-lateral axis because of the position or the areas that it covers while it passes. Although it's an imaginary line, but it has been named after the area that it covers. So it passes from medial aspect to the lateral aspect. That is why it is also known as medial-lateral axis. So it has three names by now. So it is also known as coronal axis. It is also known as frontal axis. It is also known as medial-lateral axis. So always remember, when there is sagittal plane, there is coronal axis. Okay. I'll be talking about the others also when we reach up to them. Now, the coronal axis, also known as the frontal and lateral axis, it bisects the body from front to back, dividing into the left. Okay, stop. Not this. Now we have to talk about the movements that corresponds the sagittal plane, or the movements which are parallel to the sagittal plane, or I can also say that the movements which are happening around or which are happening along with the sagittal plane. All the flexions, all the bendings, all the dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, all such movements comes in your sagittal plane. So all these movements are occurring along with the sagittal plane. Okay, so if I am doing this movement, it is parallel to the sagittal plane. Okay, if I am doing this movement, it is parallel to the sagittal plane. So here you can see I am showing you a video here. So that is the ankle dorsiflexion and ankle plantar flexion. So ankle dorsiflexion, plantar flexion also. Suppose this is the foot. This is my ankle joint. So it is coming like this and this. So it is parallel to this plane and the axis would be mediolateral. Okay, so I'm showing you this movement. So it is going like this and this, coming up and going down along with the mediolateral axis. Okay, so I can say that dorsiflexion and plantar flexion comes under the umbrella of sagittal plane and mediolateral axis or coronal axis or frontal axis. What other movements can be there is flexion, obviously I talked about, extension that can be there, forward bending of the spine, forward bending of the neck, forward bending of the head, backward bending of the head, backward bending of the neck and backward bending of the spine. Okay, these all movements comes under the sagittal plane and frontal axis. Okay, and obviously I gave you an example of dorsiflexion, plantar flexion as well. Alright, moving forward. The next plane I'm talking about is the horizontal plane. Just look at this table. This table is a best example of transverse plane or horizontal plane. Let me tell you one thing. Horizontal plane is also known as transverse plane. Okay, so this table is the best example of your transverse plane or horizontal plane. And the another best universal example is your ground, earth. Earth is again a very good example of transverse plane. It is an imaginary plane which divides the body into two equal halves, that is upper and lower, or you can also say that superior and inferior. Okay, so I'll repeat it again. That this is horizontal plane is an imaginary surface that divides the body into two equal halves, and the two equal halves are superior and inferior or upper or lower, you can say that. Okay, now the axis that corresponds with the transverse plane is the vertical axis. It means if this is the plane or if this is the plane, suppose this is the plane, so the axis has to be perpendicular to the plane. So it will be going like this. Okay, it will be going like this down. Alright, so the axis which is perpendicular to the transverse or the horizontal plane is known as the vertical axis. Okay, so the movements will be happening around this axis. Okay, अगर इस axis को मैंने ऐसे घुमाया तो हाथ ऐसे घूम जाएगा. So अब जो सारे ऐसे घूमने वाले movements हुए, मतलब rotation वाले movements हुए, that would come under the umbrella of the horizontal plane or the transverse plane. Okay, so if I'm going like this, see, this is the plane, I'm parallel to the plane. Okay, I'm turning on the side, I've turned on the right side, I've turned on the left side, so that becomes your movement in the horizontal plane. I'll just show this to you. So you can see that the trunk that turns on the right side or the left side, that comes under your horizontal plane or the transverse plane. And the same thing that the rotation of the shoulder or the rotation of any joint, you can say that. Suppose I'm talking about the rotation of shoulder. So if the shoulder gets rotated like this, lateral rotation, and the shoulder comes back inside, medial rotation. So this lateral and medial rotation also comes under the umbrella of your transverse plane or horizontal plane. Alright. Now the other movements like supination, pronation, that is the movement of your radioulnar joint. That is the movement of the forearm. So if you want to visualize this movement, always do this. Okay. So if I'm doing like this or this or this, so the movement which is happening like this comes under your transverse plane or the horizontal plane. Okay. The other movements that comes under this plane also includes retraction and protraction of the scapula, horizontal abduction and adduction of the shoulder, that also comes, and rotations I have already talked about. Okay, it can be cervical rotation also, it can be lumbar rotation also, it can be thoracic rotation also. All right, the rotation of all these spines, the rotation movement or the spinning movement of your shoulder, and the supination pronation movement of your forearm, that comes under your the umbrella of your horizontal plane or the transverse plane, which happens around the vertical axis. Okay, I am pretty sure that you must be clear now regarding at least with two axes and two planes, that is the sagittal plane and the horizontal plane. Now one plane is left and the corresponding axis obviously is left. So the last plane that we'll be talking about today is your frontal plane. Okay. Frontal plane is also known as the coronal plane. Remember, we talked about it a few minutes back that we have two coronal sutures coming here. The suture, the joint that connects the frontal bone and the parietal bone. That joint is known as frontal suture or coronal suture. Okay. The plane that corresponds this like this. So the plane that corresponds these sutures is known as a frontal plane or coronal plane. Okay. Now, coronal plane is again an imaginary body or imaginary surface that divides the body into two equal halves, that is anterior and posterior. Okay. Now, I'll repeat it again. Okay. So, frontal plane is an imaginary surface that divides the body into two equal halves, anterior and posterior. Okay. Now, the surface or the imaginary line that corresponds the frontal plane is the sagittal axis. Okay. I forgot to tell you one important thing was that the vertical axis is also known as supero-inferior axis because it is going from superior to inferior. Okay. So, coming back onto the frontal plane, the frontal plane is also pause. Okay. The axis that corresponds with the frontal plane is the sagittal axis. Okay. Now the parts that we have talked about regarding this plane is the frontal plane divides the body into anterior and posterior. So the axis, suppose this is the surface, this is the plane that we have talked about. Okay. So the axis shall always be perpendicular to it like this. Okay, like this. So the axis which is perpendicular to the frontal plane is the sagittal axis. Sagittal axis is also known as antero-posterior axis. Always remember one special key, one small key I'll give you. You'll be able to remember each and every name. Okay. When I talk about the frontal axis, I told you that it is also known as medial lateral axis. When I told you about the vertical axis, I said that it is also known as supero-inferior axis. When I told you about the sagittal axis, I told you it is also known as antero-posterior axis. Remember one thing. When I told you that the sagittal plane divides the body into two equal halves, which were the halves? Medial and lateral, or left or right? When I told you about the transverse plane, I told you that the two body parts which it divides is upper and lower, or superior and inferior. When I told you about the frontal plane, I told you that it divides the body into two equal halves, anterior and posterior. So always remember these names, like with the names of the part are available or part which are being divided by that particular plane. ऑलवेज हमेशा याद रखो कि जो प्लेन बॉडी को जिन दो पार्ट्स में डिवाइड कर रही है, उन दो पार्ट्स को जोड़ने का काम कर रही है एक्सिस, और उन दोनों पार्ट्स को आपने जोड़ा और इस एक्सिस का नाम बन गया. ठीक है. तो पहली बार में कौन से दोनों पार्ट थे? मीडियल और लेटरल में डिवाइड कर रही थी सजाइटल प्लेन, तो हमने मीडियल लेटरल को जोड़ दिया, बन गया मीडियो लैटरल एक्सिस. सेकंड में जब मैं ट्रांसवर्स प्लेन की बात कर रहा था, तो सुपीरियर और इंफीरियर दो पार्ट्स थे, मैंने दोनों पार्ट्स को जोड़ दिया, तो एक्सिस का नाम बन गया सुपेरो इंफीरियर एक्सिस. अब मैं जब फ्रंटल प्लेन की बात कर रहा हूं, तो फ्रंटल प्लेन में कौन से दो पार्ट्स हैं? एंटीरियर एंड पोस्टीरियर. मैंने दोनों पार्ट्स को जोड़ दिया, तो क्या बना? एंटेरो पोस्टीरियर एक्सिस. ओके, सो बाय दिस टाइम it has become very easy for you people to remember all these kind of names. Okay, coming on to very important part and probably the last part of this session today. So that will suggest you what can be the movements that occurs inside the human body when we talk about the frontal plane. Okay, and sagittal axis, of course. So all the movements that includes the abduction, adduction, side bendings on the right, on the left. It can be your side bending of the head, side bending of the cervical spine or the neck, and side bending of the lumbar spine or the lower back. So that corresponds in the frontal plane. And always remember, it happens around the sagittal axis. Again, the same thing when I give you examples of the peripheral joint. Okay, so when I talk about the shoulder joint, so the shoulder abduction, the abduction of the shoulder occurs around the sagittal axis, and it happens in the frontal plane. Okay, the other movements that happens in this particular plane and around this axis includes your radial deviation, ulnar deviation. So this is, just look at this portion. Okay, so it is going radial deviation, it is going towards the radius and is coming towards the ulna. So this movement also occurs in the frontal plane and around the sagittal axis. The other movement is the side flexion, side bending of the trunk that we have already talked about, and also the inversion and eversion of the foot. Suppose this is the ankle and this is the ankle and this is the foot. So when it comes inside towards medial aspect, so that is your inversion. When it goes outside towards the lateral aspect, it is called the eversion. So the inversion and eversion movement at the ankle and the subtalar joint also occurs in the frontal plane and around the sagittal axis. So that was a very brief and a wonderful session with you people. And I always say one thing, I'll repeat one small thing with you people, that teachers do not make you learn, trainers do not make you fit, and doctors do not make you healthy. So at some point of time in your life, you need to realize one thing, that your growth is your responsibility. So it's up to you that how much you grow, from where do you grow. But at the end of the day, in the whole life, it is your responsibility. So I sign off from here. This is Dr. Himanshu Mathur, Assistant Professor, Department of Physiotherapy, Jaipur University. I sign off. I'll be coming back to you in the concomitant series of these videos. Thank you so much.